Okay, so um, we're getting a very exciting s- sidrot over the beginning of Shemot. Very dramatic. We went through the 10 plagues and ended up um, with the Bnei Israel start going in a different direction, and uh, Pharaoh gets very upset that he sees that they're not coming back. He expected them to go for 3 days and then they would come back, and he's told that they're not coming back. They're going a different direction. So he gets all of his army, and his intent is not to really attack the Bnei Israel or to kill them. His intent is to use his army to bring them back. And so they pursue the Bnei Israel and finally catch up to them at the Yam Suf, which is sort of on the way. It's in the delta. It's in the Nile Delta. In other words, they're not crossing the Nile; they're crossing smaller tributaries. And so this is one of them that they're at the edge of, and the Bnei Israel will see panic because they can't cross the water; it's too deep, and the Egyptians are right behind them, and they figure it's all lost. They're going to be rounded up and taken back. But that's not what God has in mind, and that's how the parsha opens. But it's interesting that it opens first with a recognition, which is important to understand the rest of the parsha. The recognition that the Bnei Israel are essentially at least 3 generations of slaves. And they're in this slave mentality. Moshe is the only one who lived a different life. But everybody else was slaves. Their parents were slaves and their grandparents were slaves. And we're going with the idea that this was 210 years minimally that they were enslaved. So we've got 3 generations. That's all they know. And the real challenge is, well, how do you deal with people who are slaves and haven't been exposed to anything other than a life of slavery? So even God recognizes who he's dealing with. He's not dealing with the children of Yaakov, the people who came down from Canaan to Egypt when Yosef was there. He's not dealing with them. He's dealing with 3 generations later of people who are slaves, and that's all they know. They had no connection with God. God did not reveal himself during these 3 generations. They had no leader. They had nobody. In other words, it was just they knew that they were an identified minority called Bnei Israel, the children of Yaakov. That they knew, but that's all they knew. And now, as you saw at the beginning of the Parsha of Vayera, God, um, uh, well, before in the beginning of Shemot, God comes to Moshe, who's now 80 years old or 85 years old, and he says to him, your job is to get this nation out of Egypt. And here's the way it's going to happen. And he tells him the whole plan, the strategy of the 10 plagues in order to teach and punish the Egyptians and teach the gods, teach the people, not only like we talked about last week, not only the Egyptians, but also all the surrounding nations, that there is one God in the universe, there is one Ribono Shel Olam, and all the gods that they believe in don't have the powers that they attribute to them. And there's this one God of the Hebrews is the super God, and he's going to take out his people. So that's the story up to now. And um, the problem is that the people are still the same people. They're still slaves and with a slave mentality. So that's where we're starting. And God himself realizes who he's dealing with. The nation was sort of raw material of born slaves. They were raised in an Egyptian culture. They had no experience of independent living. They had no experience of any decision making. They had no ability, no military strategy or ability to be warriors because they were slaves. And certainly they had no personal responsibility. In other words, they did what slaves do. They did what they were told to do. One day was the same as the next day. And there's nothing to look forward to, nothing to look back upon. And it was the life of a slave. So at the very beginning, it was no wonder that God did not lead them straight to Canaan. The shortest route would be to go north of where they were, north of Ramses, and to cross the border where um, um, what would be there now, like the tip of Egypt, um, like um, Taba, probably around Taba. And to go up that way and then to go along the shore of the Mediterranean, but that was the land that was controlled by the Philistines, and they were very, very powerful warriors. So God said, I'm not taking them that way, Derech Eretz Plishtim, even though it's the closest route. I can't take them there because it says, Ki Amar Elohim, the bottom line, Pen Yinachem Ha'am, the people will regret that they left Egypt in the first place, Birotam Milchama, when they're confronted with war, fighting the Philistines, Vishavu Mitzrayim, and they'll just run away. They'll turn around and run back to Egypt because they believe they're just going to be crushed by the Philistines. So God said they are not ready. They're not ready to be led into the land promised to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. There has to be a period of education. There has to be a period in which the people learn about God and God's plan and what their relationship is with God. And this parsha, the focus of this parsha is about the relationship of God to the Bnei Israel, the relationship of the Bnei Israel to God, the relationship of Moshe to the Bnei Israel, and the Bnei Israel to Moshe. It's a triple, a triangular relationship that's going on in the next few stories. And the next stories are all designed to teach the Bnei Israel something from the very beginning. Each one has a lesson. Each one is called a test, because a test is something that teaches you a way to respond. And so they're going to go through 4 tests in this parsha, each one to teach something different. And we're going to see by reading the text itself, the text as it tells us the story, tells us what it is that's the key dynamic in all of these stories. And you'll see why it's so critical. So there are 4 crises that are presented. And if we look at the repetitive pattern of the triangular relationship between God, Moshe, and the Bnei Israel, we can get a deep insight into the dysfunctional relationship between God and his newborn nation, and Moshe's pedagogic approach in the next 4 educational experience. In other words, we're going to watch the dynamics of the relationship between God and the Bnei Israel, and the Bnei Israel and Moshe, and the Bnei Israel and God. Those triangular relationships are going to be the focus of each of these stories. And it comes out, it's not that we're imposing it on the stories. You'll see in the text of the story that this is what's being described. It's in fact, a chiastic structure. Remember, a couple times in the past, I've talked about the Torah using chiastic structures which tell the reader or the listener where the focus is of a unit, a narrative unit. And in this case, the structure is very clear. Remember, there's an A and an A prime. It starts and it ends. And then it's the second thing, and then it's the second from the end. And the real key, the real focus of the theme of a narrative paragraph is the center. So it starts with the event of the splitting of the sea, which is where the Egyptians are enemies. And the Parsha is going to end with the attack of Amalek, where Amalek is the enemy. The second story is going to be the Mei Meriva, Mei Hamarim at Mara, the bitter waters. And then the second from the end, the one right before Amalek, is going to be water again, and that's going to be getting water from the rock. And what the middle of the whole Parsha is going to be, and where there is the most elaboration, is the description of the mun, God giving the people the mun. Now, that's a story in and of itself, the whole mun, but we're not going to go through that. But essentially, if you read the Parsha, you would see that the center of the Parsha is the whole experience of the mun, which is a learning experience. We'll touch on it because we're going to read text from each one of these four challenges, but we won't go in the detail of the mun, which is, again, a fascinating teaching about the Bnei Israel's relationship to sustenance, or something that they're going to lessons that they're going to need when they go into Eretz Israel. Anyway, let's start from the beginning. The first experience, the first learning experience, is at the Yam Suf. Okay. Now, here, what's Moshe's task before we get to the Yam Suf? Moshe's task through all these four experiences is to attempt to get the people to recognize who God is and how to relate to God themselves. And that goes back to the very beginning. Remember, in the beginning of Shemot, when God meets Moshe for the first time, and he has this dialogue, and he tells Moshe what his task is. So Moshe says to God, well, I'll go to the Bnei Israel. I'm going to say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me. And they're going to say, what's his name? Now, when in Chumash, when you have a name means the essential nature of something. Yitzchak is called Yitzchak because of tzchok. And Yaakov is called Yaakov because he's holding on the heel of Esav. And Esav is called Esav because of his herring. In other words, every name is related to some essential attribute or characteristic. So Moshe is saying, what characteristic am I to tell them when they ask this God of the God that you're introducing us to, who is he? And God says to Moshe, tell them, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. This is what you should say to the Bnei Israel, Ehyeh has sent me to you. Now, I don't think we went into that whole thing at the Parsha of Shemot because we had too many other things to learn. But, the question you always ask is, what kind of an answer is that? I will be who I will be, or I am who I am. That's not an answer to their question, but that's not the way to translate it. If you look at that paragraph, God says to Moshe, when Moshe says, I'm not going to be able to do this, God says, Ehyeh imach, I will be with you, don't worry, Ehyeh. And when Moshe says, I am not articulate, kvad lashon, kvad peh, God says, don't worry, Ehyeh im picha, I will be with your mouth. In other words, through the name Ehyeh, God assures Moshe, and then the people, just as I will be with Moshe when he needs me in order to enable him to accomplish my goals, so I will be with you, Bnei Israel, when you need me in order to accomplish my purposes, which is to redeem you from slavery and bring you to the land promised to your forefathers. In other words, that's the nature of the name that Moshe is to explain to the Bnei Israel, which he does at the beginning of Parshat Va'era. He explains what God is going to do, what God's plan is, and of course the people don't listen, but he at least tries to explain it. So we see that the basic character of the unique relationship between God and the Bnei Israel rests upon the nation's experience of God's presence in their midst and their ability to relate to him directly as their God. That is going to be the goal of every task that's going to be described in this parsha. In other words, in each one of these situations, the goal is that the people see that God is going to be there. God is going to help them. God is going to provide their needs. Just as was with Moshe, so he's going to be with them. That's ideally. That's what should happen. Okay, but now we're going to see what really does happen. Here is the way, if we want to present the relationships in a visual way, this is what it would look like. Here is God on the top, and here is Moshe and the Bnei Israel down below. Okay, Moshe's relationship to God is very clear. The ideal, there's an ideal, and then there's a real. The ideal to the left is what should be and what these experiences should teach. That is, Moshe has the relationship with God. That's not a problem. Moshe is always in dialogue with God. Moshe always sees God. Moshe always talks to God. Moshe has no problem in his relationship with God. Ideally, the Bnei Israel should have that same relationship. When the Bnei Israel needs something, they should ask God for it, because God said he's going to be there and he's going to provide for them. That's what he's teaching them, because they don't know anything about God. And God is teaching them that he's there, don't worry, he's going to give them what they need. That's the ideal. Okay. The real is Moshe to Hashem. That doesn't need any change. That's fine. But the Bnei Israel don't have a connection to God. That's the problem. They don't now, this slave nation doesn't have a relationship with God. Rather, the entire relationship is with Moshe. So bear in mind this dynamic that's on the right side. This is the real. This is what's happening in these four crises that are being described in this parsha. Is the Bnei Israel relate only to Moshe and not to God. Okay, so watch how it happens. Now they're at the Yam Suf, right? And they in front of them is water, in back of them is the Egyptian army. Vayomru el Moshe, hamibli ein kvarim b'Mitzrayim. They're sarcastic as they will always be. Are there no graves in Mitzrayim? L'kachtanu lamut b'midbar, that you took us out in order we should die here. Mazot asita lana, what have you done? Lahotzianu miMitzrayim, that you took us out of Egypt. What have you done? Not what has God done. What have you done that you brought us out of Egypt? We already told you in Mitzrayim, Chadal mimenu, leave us alone, v'navda et Mitzrayim, we'll remain slaves. Kitov lanu avod et Mitzrayim, it's better for us to just be slaves, mimutenu b'midbar, than to die in a desert. Now look at Moshe's response. Vayomer Moshe Elohim, al tira'u, don't be afraid, don't panic. Hityatzvu, just stay where you are. Ur'u et Yeshuat Hashem, asher ya'aseh lochem hayom. and you'll see God's salvation. God's going to save you, that He's going to do today. Ki kasher ra'item et Mitzrayim hayom, the way you see Mitzrayim now as this ferocious, um, army, lo tosifu lirotam od olam. You're never going to see him this way again. Hashem yilachen lachem. God is going to fight for you, v'atem tacharishun, and you just be quiet and wait and see what God's going to do. So what's Moshe doing here? The people are turning to Moshe and they're relating only to him. They're not talking to God. They're saying, we told you we didn't want to leave because we don't want to die in the desert. Why did you take us here? We're all going to die. And Moshe said, no, you're looking in the wrong place. God is the one who is going to save you. Just wait and watch and see what he's going to do. Okay, now look at the second one. They obviously cross the Yam Suf. They're saved miraculously. Everything's wonderful. And now they travel from the Yam Suf. Vayetzu el midbar shur. Vayelechu shloshet yamim bamidbar. Now they're going 3 days in the desert. V'lo matzu mayim, and they haven't found any water. And there's a big problem. There's no water, and they have flocks, and they need water now. Vayavo merata, and they come to a place called Marah. V'lo yachlu lishtot mayim. There's water there. It's an oasis, but the water is bitter. And it's called Marata ki marim he, because the water that's in this oasis is too bitter. Al kain karashmo mara. Now, what did the Bnei Israel do? Vayilonu ha'am al Moshe lemor. Who are they complaining to? Moshe. They don't turn to God and say, God, we need water. That would be what they should do. That's ideal. That's what Moshe and God are trying to teach them, but they don't. They don't relate to God at all. Vayilonu ha'am al Moshe. Ma nishteh. What are we supposed to drink? Vayitzach el Hashem, and he, Moshe, calls to God. Vayorehu Hashem eitz, and God teaches him, uses the word yoreh. Yoreh comes from the word teach, lahorot. And he teaches him about a particular kind of a tree or a shrub. Vayashlech el hamayim, and God says, take this and toss it in the water. Vayimteku hamayim, and the water will become sweet. Sham samlo choku mishpat, v'sham nisahu. By doing this action, God taught them something about rules, choku mishpat, something about rules, and there he tested them. Okay, what kind of a test is it? And the narrative that comes with this physical description, Moshe explains what this sort of metaphorical experience was. Vayomer, im shamoa tishma lekol Hashem Elokecha. If you listen to God, this is you do the choku mishpat. You listen to the rules. V'hayashar be'einav ta'aseh. And if you do what's right in His eyes, in other words, you do what He asks you to do. V'hazanta lemitzvotav, and you listen to His mitzvot. V'shamarta kol chukav, and you follow His instructions. Kol machala asher samti b'mitzrayim lo asim alecha. All of the machalot, the discomforts, the diseases that I put on Mitzrayim, I won't put on you, ki ani Hashem rofecha, because I'm not God who is a punisher, I am God who is a healer. And so if you do the right thing, you listen to me, you do the mitzvot, then I don't need to punish you for anything because I want to heal you. I want to teach you something constructive. That's what this first instance is supposed to teach the people. Okay.
Steve, that seems like a lot to expect.
Well, yes, but again, this is all a step-by-step experiential learning. Okay, so at the beginning, it is a lot of to expect. Okay, so the incident, we'll take a look. The incident, what is it that he's trying to teach them? The incident at Mara is called a test. What's the implication of using this word? In other words, what is it that he's trying to teach by this? What's the symbol about God teaching Moshe about a tree that's going to transform bitter water to sweet? And how is that associated with rules, with Chok Mishpat? And so it tells us, in other words, whenever there is a symbolic experience, there's an accompanying narration that explains it. So in this case, the explanation is if you listen to God's voice and do what's right, and keep the laws, then everything that I put on the Egyptians, all these plagues and discomforts, I won't put on you. So what is it? What is the essential experience of this event? The experience of Mara was the initial educational experience. It's the first key educational experience that's necessary for what's going to happen from then on. Since this is the first of many bitter experiences, remember the water is bitter. So consider the metaphor of bitter water is bitter experiences. So God's needed to teach the people how they were to respond to all future challenging events. Each of the inevitable discomforting experiences, they're going to experience discomfort for the next period of time. At the beginning, it wasn't 40 years. It was only supposed to be 2 years as they were traveling and being taught. But it turned out to 40 years because of the spy problem. But each of these inevitable discomforting experience, there's going to be lack of food, there's going to be lack of water, there's going to be attack by hostile nomads like Amalek, there's going to be insecurity about the future, they're not going to know where they're going or how they're going to get there. There's going to be inability to settle in one place. They're going to move from place to place. All of these will appear to them to be unpalatable. Unpalatable. It's like you can't drink it. You can't swallow it. They're not able to assimilate or digest these discomforting experiences. So God says, let me teach you something. I'll teach through Moshe, I'm teaching you about a tree that if you put it in bitter waters, it turns sweet and palatable. What is it that's going to make these uncomfortable experiences that inevitably you're going to experience for the next period of time? What's going to make them palatable? It's the metaphor through God's teaching. If you listen to God's words and if you do what he says, the bitterest circumstances can be transformed into tolerable, even sweet situations that you notice the word lahorot, he taught him something. Lahorot is the same root word as Torah, teaching. In other words, the teachings of God that are infused into the bitter experiences will turn them into palatable experience and even sweet experiences by infusing the bitter experience with the tree. And perhaps a tree, remember, Eitz Chaim Hi, Lemachazikim Ba. The tree is a symbol of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, Eitz Chaim Hi. That same experience becomes palatable and even life sustaining. In other words, the educational experience of this first crisis, not the first one, the first one was the Yam Suf, of this second crisis, this is the fundamental teaching that God wants to teach, that future um, future discomforting experiences, the lack of food, the lack of water, the attacks, all of these things will will appear that they're not able to experience it. They're not able to do it. But if they listen to God, follow his teachings, see what it is that he's trying to teach them, then those experiences become constructive experiences, not negative experiences. So when one perceives an event to be unjust or unfair, which they do, how do the Bnei Israel experience, well, there's no water here. This is terrible. This is unfair. Why did you take us out into this desert? We're all going to die. When they experience it that way, they continue to accuse Moshe of injustice. And they say that it was unfair that Moshe took him into a desert to die. They lacked faith and trust in God and God's promise that he would bring them into the land. It was a show of a lack of faith. And the lack of faith made these things miserable, because what could they have done? Think of it for a minute. If we were rewriting this, when the Bnei Israel go 3 days and they see there's no water, what they could have done is to say, God, you took us out of Egypt. You said that you're going to bring us into the promised land of our forefathers, but there's no water and there's no food. So what are you going to do? How are you going to sustain us? If they did that, that would be fine, because that's what God wants. He wants them to relate to him, and he's very happy to give them what they want. But they can't. They don't. They don't relate to him. All they do is accuse Moshe of taking them into the desert to kill them in the desert. They suffered through their desert experience because they had a lack of belief. If you look at the rest of the book of Shemot and the book of mostly Vayikra is mostly the Mishkan, but go to Bamidbar. If you look at Shemot and Bamidbar and the beginning of Devarim, all of these are experiences that are challenging experiences, but they have no belief in God. Rather, they blame Moshe for everything. They continually believe they're being treated unjustly because they don't listen to God, they don't follow his teachings.
But Stephen also, and God isn't getting angry at them. It seems like he's just not
No,
expecting them to
right.
to
He's trying to teach them. It's like a teacher doesn't get
right,
angry with students. He's trying to teach them by different experiences what they have to learn. So,
exactly.
so God says that he states at the end of this metaphorical event, with living one's life by God's teachings and having faith in his justice as an attitude towards misfortune, it will be unnecessary to use chastisements as a means of teaching. He won't have to punish them like he did in Egypt. Egypt didn't learn anything, and that's why he had to continue to punish them. But if the Bnei Israel would learn what he's trying to teach them, then he wouldn't have to have all of these punishments, which in fact is what happens. God has to punish the Bnei Israel a half dozen times before they reach Eretz Israel. Okay, so this is a lesson, a critical lesson that needs to be learned, but in reality, ideally they would learn it. In reality, they do not learn it. Okay, and so we go to the next crisis. Again, follow what the text says. Next crisis is there's no food. So they had water, okay, but now they have no food. So what do? They don't cry out to God. They don't say, God, we need food. Please give us food, which he'd be happy to do, but they don't. They veilonu kol adat b'nei Yisrael al Moshe v'el Aharon b'midbar. They complain to Moshe and Aaron. Vayomra alehem b'nei Yisrael. Mi temutenu b'yad Hashem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Better that we all died, that God just killed us in Mitzrayim. B'shivtenu al sir habasar, while we're sitting around this pot of food and we can eat as much matzah as we want. Kiyotzeti otanu el hamidbar hazeh, that instead you didn't leave us alone and let us just be there as slaves and eat a pot of food with matzah, but you took us into this desert, lahamit et kol hakahal hazeh barav, in order that we'll all die of famine. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim. Okay, they're not talking to me, they're talking to you, but my plan was from the very beginning, I am going to feed them. I'm going to make food come down from heaven miraculously. V'yatza ha'am v'yoktu devar yom b'yomo lemana nisenu. I'm going to do this in order for it to be another teaching experience. Anytime you see the word anasenu, it's a challenge or a test or a teaching experience. And the experience is Hayelech b'torati imlo. Are they going to keep my rules like I told them at Mara, or are they not? And this time it's going to be related to the man. V'haya bayom hashishi, on the sixth day, on a Friday, I skipped the part where it's going to come down every day and they have to collect it in the morning and they have to collect only what they need and they can't keep it overnight. I skipped all that part, but those are all there's a whole bunch of rules that come with the month. And God wants to know if they're going to abide by the rules or not. Okay, so then, when it comes on the sixth day, instead of there being only enough for one day, they're going to get double. Vayomer Moshe v'al Aaron el bnei Yisrael, erev vidatem ki Hashem hotzi etchem Yisrael. Now Moshe, you see, is deflecting it to God. He's saying, wait, tonight you're going to see that God is the one who's providing you with food and with drink. Bidatem ki Hashem hotzi etchem, and He is the one who took you out of Egypt to sustain you, to bring you to the promised land. He didn't take you out of Egypt to starve you and to make you all die of famine. Uvaboker, and in the morning, uri'item et kavod Hashem, and you'll see God's power, God's presence, God's glory, b'shamu et telunotechem, that He listened to your complaints. Nachnu v'nachnu ma, and who are we, kitalinu aleinu, that you keep complaining to us? Don't complain to us. You need to relate to God, not to us. Don't complain to us. God will give you whatever you need. Vayomer Moshe b'teit Hashem lachem be'erev basar le'echol v'lechem baboker lisboa bishmoa Hashem et telutosechem. God has heard your complaints and He's going to give you meat at night with the slav, and He's going to give you bread in the morning with the mun, and He heard your complaints that you complained to us about. You didn't complain to Him, you complained to us. V'nachnu ma, and us, lo aleinu telunosechem ki al Hashem. Don't complain to us that you're going to the wrong place. What God wants is for you to relate to Him. He's trying to teach you to relate to Him, and that He is the one who is going to give you whatever you want. And don't deflect it. Don't blame Moshe. Don't complain to Moshe. You can just relate to me, and you'll see that I am your God. That's what He wants to show. Because again, these are slave people who have no concept of relating to a God. What did they do in Egypt? In Egypt, you had to relate to the Egyptian priests, and the priests would be the ones who were the middleman who related to the gods. But they could never relate directly to a God. That concept was just out of their life experience. And Moshe was trying to teach them, God and Moshe was trying to teach them, is you can relate to God directly. It's not like you were brought up in Egypt where you have to go through somebody else. This was the source of the Chet HaEgel. They thought they had to go through an Egel. That'll come later. Okay, now, here is the second issue of water. And here, there's going to be an interesting change. So watch the text very carefully. Vayorev ha'am im Moshe. And again, the people do what they have been doing. They haven't changed their pattern. They haven't gotten the idea that they should relate to Moshe, to God rather than Moshe. Vayorev ha'am im Moshe. The people now rebel against Moshe. They complain to Moshe, Vayomru, Tenu lanu mayim. You and Aaron give us water, v'nishtes, so we can drink. Vayomer lahem Moshe. And Moshe's respond is, Matrivuni madi, why are you challenging me? Why are you complaining to me? Why are you testing God? Why are you not doing what it is that God wants you to do? He wants you to talk to him, not talk to me. Vayitzma ha'am lamayim, the people are getting starved for water. Vayolen ha'am al Moshe vayomer lama zeh leisanim Yitzrayim. The same pattern, the same complaint, the same language. Why did you take us out of Egypt? Lahamit oti ve'et banai ve'et miknai batzama, in order to kill me and my children and my cattle in a famine, in thirst, that there is no water. And Moshe now is like losing his cool. I mean, he can't get through to the people. Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem lemor, ma'aseh. What am I going to do with these people? Od ma'atus kaluni. I mean, they are so stubborn and hard-headed and clueless that they're going to stone me. Vayomer Hashem Moshe. All right, listen. I'm going to do it differently this time. Avor lefanai ha'am. Take the people. V'kach itcha, and take from the people representative, the Ziknei Yisrael, the ones that they listen to, the elders. Umatcha asher hikita bo et haya'ar kach biyadecha v'halachta. Take the staff that you used to make miracles in Egypt and go to this mountain. Hinani omed lefanecha sham al hatzur b'chorev. I am going to, my presence is going to be manifest on top of the rock in Chorev. V'hikita batzur, and I want you to hit the rock. V'yatsu mimenu mayim, and water is going to come out of this rock. V'shata ha'am, and the people who will have plenty to drink. Vayas Moshe Cain, and Moshe did this. He took his staff, he hit the rock while God's presence was on top of the rock. Le'enei Ziknei Yisrael, in front of the Ziknei Yisrael, in front of all the representatives of Israel. Now remember, there were so many people, not everybody could see, but the Ziknei Yisrael were the elders who were in the front, and they can see this miraculous thing. They see God's presence, they see Moshe hit the rock, and they see water come the rock, and there's plenty of water for everybody. Vayikra Shem Hamakom Masa Meriva. They called this place a place of testing and rebelliousness. Al Riv B'nei Israel, V'al Nasotam et Hashem Lemor, Hayesh Hashem B'kirbeinu Im Ayin. God taught them, this is another teaching experience, for them to see, to answer the question, Hayesh Hashem B'kirbeinu, is God really here or is he not here? And what God did is to show, yes, I am really here. My presence manifested itself on top of a rock, and Moshe hit the rock and water came from it, so I'm here. It's not Moshe who's doing it, I'm doing it. So in other words, God is giving them a visual representation that God's presence is there. And what's the purpose of the teaching? To teach them, don't put all this on Moshe. Don't keep blaming Moshe and complaining to Moshe. I'm here. You're the one who are supposed to, you have to relate to me, not to Moshe. Okay? It's the same theme in all of these experiences. Okay? And each time Moshe is trying to teach them that they have the wrong address. Every time they're complaining to Moshe and Aaron, and they're thinking that he's done this to kill them in the desert, when in fact God has promised to keep them alive, give them water, give them food. Just ask for it. He's trying to get them to relate to God. So
Yeah, but
they're
Steve,
almost, yeah.
I'm sorry. No, I
Go ahead.
almost see that as problematic because from the text, it looks like Moshe and the Ziknei Yisrael. Moshe is the one who's providing the water. Um, I don't
Well,
see where it
well, but look at this
conveys.
last. The last event, the one that we just described. Here, God's presence is actually seen above a rock. And then he tells Moshe, make water come out of this rock. So it's God's, in other words, if God's presence wasn't there, it would seem as if Moshe is doing it by himself. Okay. And the people can't get that through their head that God is behind it. But here, in this instance, God's presence is at the rock, and the people can see God's presence. So that's supposed to be the final clear indicator that God is there and they can relate to him. And now it's done through Moshe, but at least God is there. And the other ones in the previous three crises, God's presence was not available. They didn't see God's presence. And so they only turned to Moshe, and Moshe was trying to convince them that God is the one who's doing this. He's going to give you mun. He's going to give you water. He's going to turn the water, and he's going to do all this thing. But that didn't make an impression. Here, God actually appears. And so, in other words, he's giving them as much as he can give them to convince them. You see the last line? To address the issue, Hayesh Hashem Bikirbenu, is God really here? Imayin or not? And the answer is yes, I'm here. So he's trying to convince them clearly to answer that question. Yes, God is here, and if you need something, if you want something, relate to God. Oops, going the wrong way. Okay, so we're almost there. In other words, Moshe clearly is connected to God. That's not an issue. The Bnei Israel are always connected with Moshe. That's the problem, and not to God. But now, in this last episode, with water from the rock, the Bnei Israel were given the opportunity to actually see God's presence behind the miracle of water. And that was supposed to convince them that it's not Moshe who took them out of Egypt. It's not Moshe who led them in the desert in order to kill them. It's not Moshe who's providing the food and the water. All of this is God, and it's God's plan. So you would think that this worked. Okay. Problem is, it doesn't. It doesn't. And because remember in Parshas Devarim, all the way at the end of the story, when he's making his last sermon to the Bnei Israel, he says to them, he led you through the vast and dreadful desert, the dry and waterless land, with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of a rock. He gave you manna to eat, something your fathers had never known. And he's done that for the next 40 years in order to test you, that in the end it might go well with you, that you will relate to God and follow his teachings. So the goal is an elusive goal. In other words, it never stuck. It stuck maybe right there, but it never stuck for the rest of the experience of the Bnei Israel, of that nation, of that generation in the desert, which explains why that generation just could never go into Eretz Israel. They could never enter, and it's going to explain why that last event that we're going to read in the end of Bamidbar, of Moshe 40 years later at the rock getting them water, why that was such a devastating experience that Moshe lost his opportunity to go into Eretz Israel because of that. If you remember this year, and by the time we get to the end in Devarim, in another 8 months from now, you'll see how it explains why Moshe was not allowed to take the Bnei Israel into Eretz Israel. Okay. Well, we let me stopping the share.
I think we're still. I think we're still.
Right. Look, it was the problem entirely through the whole experience of the 40 years in the desert. The people never, they always related to Moshe. There was the basis of the golden calf. It was everything that they did wrong. It was because they couldn't bring themselves to just say, "We believe in you, God. We believe you promised to bring us in. We believe that you're going to take care of us. You're going to keep your promise." They could never do that. They couldn't do it, and so they that whole generation had to die out. And then it's only their children who had 40 years of educational experiences in the desert that had the opportunity to start all over and to start with Yehoshua leading them across the border.
Very good. Thank you very much for another excellent class.
Sure, of course.